Welcome to the Thursday edition of the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast, a podcast for English teachers in search of creative teaching strategies. Whether you're new to the show or a longtime listener, I'm really glad you're here for today's edition of Highly Recommended. On this week's short episode, I want to answer a question from our community about lesson planning. Here it is. How do you plan? I'm struggling to put together a series of lessons that culminate into a bigger assignment. For example, if I want my students to end up writing a persuasive essay, what would I plan to prepare them to write it? Do you go with a theme? Make it part of a novel study? I'm struggling. Okay, this is a big question, but I'm so here for it. In today's episode, we're digging into planning and demystifying the process. Maybe you've heard the phrase, plan with the end in mind. This concept of backwards design, now widely used for lesson planning, comes from Jay McTeague and Grant Wiggins' book, Understanding by Design. The University of Illinois' Center for the Advancement of Teaching Excellence online site has a useful, quick summary. Let me give you the speedy version here. First, you figure out what you want your students to be able to do. Then you figure out how they could show that they can do it. Finally, you plan the activities and assessments that will get them there. So let's apply this planning framework to today's problem. How do you plan a unit around a persuasive essay? The goal is to have students write a strong essay, presumably with some specific characteristics appropriate to their age, to their level. Along the way, they can show their mastery of elements of that final essay through smaller argument practices. Then they'll show their overall mastery of everything at once in the essay. But what would be good activities to build in along the way? The easy go-to for preparing for an essay like this would be to write lots of short pieces throughout the unit, which really could be centered on anything. You could embed work like this into a novel study, a deep dive into short stories, book clubs, poetry, or even podcasting. This will give you an inviting structure in which to situate your writing practice. You can practice thesis statements, introductions, text analysis paragraphs, and conclusions based on your larger unit. And you can think about how to come at each of these from different angles and with different types of prompts to help students stay interested. You could share mentor texts, incorporate peer review, station work, and writing makerspace elements. There are a ton of different ways to practice these individual skills. So let's just try it. Here's how I might plan the first week of a poetry unit focused on this final product of a persuasive essay. It's Monday. Monday, I might do a deep dive on a contemporary poet, sharing 2 of her performance pieces and doing some creative writing around her work with my students. Then I might share an online article about this poet, arguing that she should have been the winner of a prestigious spoken word poetry competition, and ask students to identify the thesis statement in the article and discuss in partners whether or not they found that argument convincing. So on this lesson, I've sort of introduced something engaging. We've talked about contemporary poetry. We've done some creative writing, but then we've sort of turned our focus to argument, right? We're starting to warm up to the topic of this overall assessment that we're building toward. On Tuesday, I might look at a contemporary poem in both its written and spoken form and have students do a little mini debate about which format feels more compelling. Do they prefer to read the poem? Do they prefer to listen to the poem? Then I might dive into a mini lesson on thesis statements and have kids practice writing a thesis for the question we just debated, and then practice gathering some evidence. Maybe ask everyone to find 2 pieces of evidence that could help them make the argument about whether they think the poem is more effective in its written or its spoken form. Now it's Wednesday. Wednesday, we might start by trading those thesis statements that we just practiced writing and giving each other feedback based on some kind of a little checklist of what makes a good thesis. From there, we might take a break from the argument writing and move into a pop-up poetry workshop and create quick performance pieces of our own. Thursday, we might look at a performance piece and work on annotating a text version of it. Then again, practice developing a thesis statement about it and gathering evidence to support that thesis. On Friday, we might start with a mini lesson on writing a full introduction and then write a practice introduction around that thesis statement, looking at some models, maybe doing some swapping before moving into our regular first chapter Friday program for choice reading. Okay, now I've planned 1 week of the unit, building toward my final assessment, but also moving through a poetry unit that I think is valuable for both engagement and other types of learning goals. And I've kind of continued with a consistent element of choice reading that I always want to keep incorporating into my classes. In the next week, we can practice text analysis paragraphs and conclusions. We can look at more mentor texts involving poetry-related arguments, and we can continue exploring the work of contemporary poets and furthering these choice reading goals that I always have on my mind. In general, planning a unit means juggling a lot of different pieces, right? There's the learning goals, the types of activities that can engage and support many different learners, the meaningful ongoing programs that you want to be consistent about, and of course, your overall engagement, keeping kids interested, giving them choice, creating lessons around materials that they will find intriguing. It really does get easier the more you do it. This week, I highly recommend keeping backwards design in, well, the back of your mind the next time you go to plan a unit.